So today we're looking at utilitarianism, and this is chapter 2.4 in the ethics section of the OCR specification. So first we have these key terms, so pause the video and see whether you can define all of these key terms before we go into them. So definitions. So the idea that the choice that brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number is the right choice. And that is all that utilitarianism is based on. It's greatest happiness for the greatest number. The hedonic calculus is the system for calculating the amount of pain or pleasure generated by an action. And we'll look into how this works and what it entails as well. Consequentialism. And this is an ethical theory that sees morality as driven by the consequences rather than the actions or character of those concerned. So from this we can see utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory where we look at the results of the action taken, and that will determine whether it is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Quantitative. This is focused on quantity. So how many or how big something is, the amount. If you look at the greatest happiness principle, is the amount of happiness that it causes. And this amount will be the greatest happiness principle. Whilst qualitative focuses on quality, so what kind of thing. And act utilitarianism weighs up what to do at each individual occasion. And finally, rule utilitarianism weighs up what to do in principle in all occasions of a certain kind. I'll also add on preference utilitarianism onto this as an extra bit to add to your knowledge on the utilitarian spectacle. Preference utilitarianism, if you want to define it and use it in your exam, is basically just the preference of what something does determines whether it is the right thing to do. So just to recap, utilitarianism is an ethical theory that tries to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So it is teleological. If we remember what teleological means, it is purpose-driven. So focusing on the results of an action rather than the motivation of the individual. Principle of utility was discovered by Jeremy Bentham, which is his to my right at UCL in his unbound body. And he introduced the idea of utilitarianism. So he wanted to find a way of doing ethics that did not rely on church rules or the church itself. And he wanted to help reform society at the time. So a really good example of this is he opened up UCL, so the University College London, which at the time was the only university that allowed anybody from any classes to attend uni, as well as women. So he's the first university that allowed women to also get an education. And therefore, utilitarianism is a very egalitarian theory. So in that sense, egalitarian just means that it promotes equality. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, whatever. Everyone is treated equally in this form of ethics. Bentham also thought that everyone desires pleasure and hopes to avoid pain, and this is an assumption he makes within utility. The principle of utility is otherwise known as the greatest happiness principle. So it is a principle that says that the best course of action to take is one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people and minimizes pain. And this is really important. We'll look in the hedonic calculus how pure the action also is, takes consideration into whether it is the ethical thing to do or not. So here is the hedonic calculus. So Bentham devised the hedonic calculus, or it's also known as a philosophic calculus. So just be aware that it can be defined in these two different ways, or referred to in these two different ways within your exam. So be sure to know it is the same thing. So as a way of measuring whether an action can bring about maximum pleasure and avoid pain. And to calculate the pleasure or pain an action is likely to generate, there are several factors to consider. The first one is intensity. So will it be intense pleasure or just mild? So in this way we can really look into whether the pleasure is going to be very intense, how much happiness, how much joy is it going to bring, or whether it's going to be very lacking in that intensity. So for example, if a woman has a baby, for example, the amount and intensity of the pleasure of giving birth is a much higher one than a lower one. A lower version of intensity might be something like me enjoying a piece of cake in that moment. The second one is duration. So how long is the pleasure likely to last? Is it going to last a couple of hours? Is it going to last a couple of years? Or is it going to last decades? This is really important as well. And also remember, if it amounts to the greatest amount as well, that's the important thing to consider here. So you also need to consider whether this duration is going to be happiness or whether it's going to be pain. And that's also going to determine whether it is the greatest thing to do and the right thing to do. So with duration, for example, if we stick with a woman having a baby, if she has a baby, the happiness is going to last a lifetime, whilst my happiness of eating the piece of cake is just going to last a couple of minutes or however long it takes me to eat the cake. Then we have certainty or uncertainty. So will it definitely bring pleasure, and how likely is the pleasure going to be? So again, if we stick with the pregnant woman example, it is very likely that she will have the pleasure of her child and the lifelong pleasure of raising her child and the good things that brings that to a woman, if you want the child, this is. So that certainty is very true if the woman wanted the child, and it is certain it will bring her happiness. There will be pain, obviously, at some moments, but that all depends. In terms of my cake eating, it's uncertain whether I'm going to enjoy the cake if I haven't tasted the cake before. So again, you can weigh up the different certainties there. Proportionality is how far off in the future is the pleasure or pain going to happen. Is it going to happen right now, or is it going to happen in the distant future? So again, with the pregnant woman example, she goes through pain of 9 months when she's pregnant, and whilst in labour, it might be hours. But once she has the baby, then the pleasure is going to last, and it will be sure off that it's going to happen. However, my eating the cake example, my pleasure is going to happen imminently. So I don't have to wait for it as much as the pregnant woman would have to. Then we have fecundity, and this is asking, is the pleasure likely to lead to other pleasures as well? So for example, whether something else good is going to happen. So with the pregnant woman example, her pleasure will lead to possibly having grandkids or future children, or her child causing her pleasure within watching him or her being raised and possibly becoming very successful in their careers. That was likely to lead to other pleasures. Me eating my cake might not last to other pleasures because I might run out of cake and that might not cause me pleasure. I mean, these are very silly examples, but they're a way of really illustrating what to do within each of these steps. One is purity. So will it bring pure pleasure, or will there be some pain included as well? So with the pregnant woman, we know that there's going to be some pain included within her pregnancy. With me eating my cake, there's not really any pain included in that, unless I've eaten too much. Then we have the extent, so how far-reaching will the pleasure be? Will it affect a lot of people? Now, if we start with my cake eating example, me eating a piece of cake isn't going to affect a lot of people, unless we change the circumstances. And let's say my best friend made me the cake, and if I don't like it, it's going to cause her pain. So that has the extent of how far it reaches. Whilst with the pregnant woman, is likely to affect other people because obviously her child will influence a lot of people within their lives as well. So I hope this illustrates how to go through each of these steps within the hedonic calculus to really understand whether we should have this or not. So in the instance of the pregnant woman, should she have an abortion? Now, we went through all of these steps, and because of everything that I've explained, the likely reason would be no, because it causes greatest happiness for the greatest number. Again, with my cake eating example, I am likely to eat the cake because it doesn't cause as much pain, as it's more pure and it's more certain. The duration, though, isn't very long, so you can kind of see how we can adapt all of these into different ethical situations. If we do it with an ethical situation, though, it might be something like the trolley example, which we'll look into now. If you've heard about the trolley example, it is that there is a train here and it's going to kill 5 people if you don't pull the lever. But if you pull the lever here, then it will be diverted the route to just kill this one person. Now, Bentham would say you should pull the lever in order to save 5 lives and kill 1. But that would mean you actively taking part in pulling the lever. So technically you would murder this one person. And for utilitarianism, for Bentham, that is the right and moral thing to do. However, what if these 5 men here were all 90-year-olds who lived a full and fulfilling life whilst this was a newborn baby, who hasn't even had its life yet? Would you pull the lever then? Think about it. You could argue that you wouldn't, because these men have already lived their lives. Although they might have loads of family members, so you have to look at the extent of this pain that it's going to cause to other people. This new baby could possibly find the new cure to cancer, for example. So if this baby died, its effect and the extent of the pain would be far more reaching than these family members. So in that situation, it would be far more likely to not pull the lever. But what if I told you that these were 90-year-old men, but this baby turned out to be Hitler? Then what would you do? In that situation, you would probably pull the lever in order to kill 1, because obviously Hitler led to a lot more pain and suffering than was ever accounted for and ever imaginable. But as you can see here, we don't really know what this baby is going to be. The certainty isn't very big, so therefore it causes a lot of dilemmas in whether you do pull the lever or you don't. And this is a really good dilemma to really illustrate within your exam. We then have the organ donor example, and I don't know whether many people have heard this, but it's a really good example to illustrate. So Bentham would say, well, there are 5 people here in hospital waiting for an organ donation. Now let's call him Sam. Sam walks in and he's perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just visiting a friend. But the doctors see that he is perfectly healthy, has all these organs. So therefore, they're locking up and kill him to take all his organs. Now, Act Utilitarianism would say, yes, that is the right thing to do because it causes greatest happiness to the greatest number. Everyone here can get a piece of Sam for the different donations of organs that they needed, and therefore it would affect 5 people, as well as all of these people's families. So in a way, it causes greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. But then we have poor Sam, who's just been killed and sacrificed in order to save 5 people. This is a really complicated ethical question, which Act Utilitarianism and Bentham would justify in killing Sam. So then we move into raw utilitarianism with John Stuart Mill, because he saw this problem. So in his book Utilitarianism in 1863, John Stuart Mill added to Bentham's ideas by making a distinction between higher pleasures and base pleasures. And this is really interesting because John Stuart Mill was technically related to Bentham. Bentham was his godfather. So this really illustrates that Mill really grew up on the principle of utilitarianism, saw the flaws and really adapted it to make it even better with raw utility. Now, what are higher and lower pleasures, or higher pleasures and base pleasures? If I refer to them as higher and lower pleasures, then know that I'm talking about the same thing. So, Mill says that the quality of the pleasure should also be included intellectual, aesthetic, social and spiritual pleasures. So if we have higher and lower pleasures here, these are higher and these are lower pleasures. So higher pleasures would be something like reading. Learning a language. So let's just put learning. Please excuse my writing with this. It might be something like listening to music and something like opera, watching a documentary, those kind of things. Whilst lower pleasures would be something like sex. watching TV, food, so you can kind of see how lower pleasures are very animalistic. They're only bodily functions, whilst higher pleasures involve the intellectual thought in your mind. There's something that Mill says as a distinction between the human aspects of what humans are capable of and what animals are capable of. So Mill famously said, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." So he said we should not be content with just seeking sensual pleasure that is animalistic, but we should be seeking these higher pleasures. So of course you need to be able to take a balance, but in this aspect he's saying, well, we can't only have these animalistic body pleasures because that's only what animals are capable of. Instead, we really need to look at the intellectual aspects and what we know to be stimulating our minds. And that is because we are human beings that are capable of reason and rationality, whilst for Mill, animals were not capable of that. The other quote that he also said, "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a normal man satisfied." So again, because Socrates is such a famous philosopher that has a lot of complex thinking and capable of this so much higher pleasure. So do use these quotes. So he thought that art and culture should be considered more important than pleasures such as getting drunk and gluttony. So getting drunk, alcohol, drugs, all in the lower pleasure aspects. So Mill thought that it could be right for an individual to sacrifice his or her own pleasure for the sake of other people. And this was something that he then came up for the harm principle. So, what is the harm principle? Mill basically said that if an action or a situation or whatever causes harm to another living being or human being, then you cannot do it, even if it causes greatest happiness for the greatest number. So, for example, if in the organ donor example, I cannot, or the doctors cannot kill Sam in order to save 5 people because he is himself harmed. So in this way, Mill comes up to protect minorities in this sense in order to underpin this ethics. So this allows for a lot of human rights abuses not to be taking place, which is obviously a really positive thing, because Mill sets in place certain rules, because he sees that generally there are certain rules within society that if we implement them, they cause the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And an example of that is the traffic light example. So within society, we have come up with the concept that if the light is green, we go. If the light is amber, we wait. And if it's red, we stop. So in this sense, we have come up with this concept of following traffic rules, and it causes the greatest happiness because it causes less accidents on the road. It causes more order on the roads. Although it can cause traffic, it means that there are greater protections for people on the road. And this can also be applied to something like do not kill. Within society, there's a rule that we follow. Law also follows this, because generally we've seen that not killing people causes greatest happiness for the greatest number in the long term. So Mill really looks into long term and the general societal aspects of what causes societal happiness, whilst Bentham doesn't do that. He looks at there in the moment. So you can kind of see how Mill also gets rid of the hedonic calculus. He implements certain rules that he has observed cause greatest happiness for the greatest number. So utilitarianism is not a single system that has several different perspectives within it. And this includes act and rule utilitarianism, and there are also other kinds. So another kind is preference utilitarianism, which I said isn't actually on the OCR specification, but it is really good to include this in order to really expand your knowledge and give you those higher marks. So for preference utilitarianism, Actions are right if they maximize the satisfaction of preferences or desires, so no matter what the preferences might be. So for this, it's easier to judge than happiness, and it includes animals' rights. And I'll give you an example here. So here I have a happy cow, and it's chilling on the grass, eating the grass, but then, let's say, Dan has a craving for a burger. So there's a dilemma here. Cow's happiness or Dan's craving for a burger. Now, the cow's preference to life is very high up. It's the highest preference that there could be, is your right to life. And Dan's preference of eating a beef burger is a lot lower on the scale. So therefore, in this situation, you could not kill the cow to have the beef burger, because the preference to life is much higher than the preference of having a beef burger. And that's what preference utilitarianism is. It can be applied to any ethical dilemma, but this is a really good one to use to illustrate this. So the differences between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So in act utilitarianism, each action is considered on its own, whilst in rule utilitarianism, the focus is on the common good rather than on each individual action. Act utilitarianism looks at the balance of pleasure and pain that is likely to be produced by the particular action in those particular circumstances, whilst rule utility looks to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number in the long run. Act, there is no duty to adopt a particular approach because a different situation might involve different people with different interests. Whilst in rule, it considers what is best for society and what would happen if everyone behaved in this way, as well as looking at the individual circumstances. Act utility also avoids setting up rules, and an act might bring about maximal pleasure in one set of circumstances, but the same act might bring about more pain in another. So, for example, a really good example to give here is an abortion example. So say Susie wanted to have an abortion because she couldn't go on a skiing holiday. But Bentham here would say, well, that's not a good reason, because if we went through the hedonic calculus like we did earlier with the pregnant woman example, her baby would cause her greatest happiness for the greatest number in overall, right, with every principle there. Whilst if Susie wanted to have an abortion because she would be kicked out of the house, her parents wouldn't accept her, they want to kick her out and because she couldn't go to university because she had to look after it because she didn't have enough money, for example, act utilitarianism would say, well, in that instance, there is much more pain than general happiness, so therefore, in that situation, they would allow the abortion to take place. So again, some good examples to give there. Whilst rule utilitarians recognise general rules that exist for the benefit of everyone, such as promise-keeping, truth-telling, not killing anyone, and rules such as having traffic lights. And generally, within the UK, we do live in a rule utilitarian principles. So here are some strengths of utilitarianism in general. It is flexible and it allows for changes in public opinion as well as differences in individual circumstances. It involves reason and sensible consideration of different options. It does not depend on external authority such as religion, but it allows people to make their own decisions according to what they feel is best for them in that situation. So it's very subjective in that sense. It's also based on practicality and on the observation that everyone wants to be happy. And it's based on outcomes which are relatively straightforward to see and to measure. And finally, every individual is considered regardless of their social status, so the egalitarian aspect is a really big strength of utilitarianism. But of course, there's also weaknesses. So for act utilitarianism, the hedonic calculus can be very time-consuming and difficult to work out, and moral decisions often have to be made very quickly. So for example, if you're deciding who to save when two people are drowning, or in the trolley example, when the train's coming and you have to decide, by the time you actually go through the hedonic calculus in your mind, the train might have already passed and killed the people and you wouldn't have even decided or had time to pull the lever or decided not to. So in that sense, it just takes too long. Some people argue that happiness is not a sufficient goal for ethics. So goodness and happiness for some people are not the same at all. We are not always good at guessing what will make us happy, and even if it is hard to work out, what will make other people happy as well. So in this aspect, it's not very good at helping us to decide what will cause the greatest happiness, because we're not really sure always. Some people also argue that morality of an action should not be judged by its outcome, but by its motivation, so the intention of what we're going to do. Some people also criticise utilitarianism because it does not make any reference to God, and this is mostly a criticism by theists. There is also, if the greatest happiness for the greatest number is always the principle, then those who are in the minority, who are made happy by different things, really lose out. So again, this causes a lot of human rights violations. Like I said, with active utilitarianism, it would allow for the death of Sam as an organ donor for everyone else, even though he is completely healthy. So that allows for the killing of someone for no reason, to save others. But what should have happened is the other people should get donations from other people that are maybe already dying. That's what maybe active utilitarianism doesn't really consider. But again, it's quite a difficult ethical decisions to take place, so really take play in analysing what to do there. Here you have some questions for your AO1 knowledge. So test your knowledge and see whether you can reply to or answer all of these questions. And if you can, then you know all your AO1 knowledge. And again, we're going to do some essay practice because practice makes perfect. So the first question is, how useful is utilitarianism as a guide to moral decisions? And here, obviously, start with your introduction, go through all of the different utilitarianisms, and then do your strengths and your weaknesses. You could possibly also give an alternative theory, such as Kantian ethics, natural moral law, or situation ethics, or virtue ethics, if that's on your specification, to give as an alternative, and maybe it might be a better guide to making moral decisions, but only do that once you've gone through everything, the hedonic calculus, rule utilitarianism, and preference utilitarianism, and gone through strengths and weaknesses of all of those, and then conclude at the end. Again, here, utilitarianism fails because it is impossible to measure happiness and harm. Discuss. Again, very similar to this question, but it's all in the way that you phrase it. So with this question, you'd really have to make sure that you refer back to utilitarianism failing because it's impossible to measure happiness and harm. Again, with the harm, you can really refer to rule utilitarianism and the harm principle, the protections. So again, you might decide that active utilitarianism might be bad, but rule utilitarianism is a lot stronger. And preference utilitarianism, you can decide what you want to do on that one. Again, you can end with another theory if you think it is better at measuring happiness and harm. And conclude at the end. You might conclude that happiness isn't enough for an ethical theory. So again, really play around with that. With all the examples that I've given you, you should be able to really smash this question. So join me next time for more philosophy, ethics, and religious studies.